Hey, fighters of fate. Welcome to English Story School. Part 1. The question that burns. What would you do if the one dream you chased for years slipped right out of your hands in a single, merciless moment? Think about it. You prepare for years, every sleepless night, every book read, every mock interview practiced in front of the mirror, every ounce of belief you carried like oxygen, only to find yourself standing on the other side of rejection. Not just rejected, but shattered. Picture this. A young man walking through the shining glass doors of the company he had dreamed of working at since he was a teenager. To him, this place wasn't just a workplace. It was the temple of his ambition, the stage where he believed his life would finally begin. He had ironed his shirt the night before with precision, rehearsed answers until his voice went hoarse, and carried a small notebook of quotes he believed would inspire him in the waiting lobby. His hands trembled with a mix of nerves and hope. His heart was pounding like a drumbeat, echoing, "This is it. This is your chance." But then came a moment. Sitting across the panel of suited executives, he opened his mouth, and the words refused to cooperate. His mind, so full of prepared speeches, went blank. His throat dried up. The confidence he thought was unshakable began to tremble under the weight of their cold stares and sharp questions. "Why should we hire you?" a voice asked. He knew the answer by heart, but the sentence tumbled out broken, unsure, lifeless. He could feel himself drowning in the silence between his stutters. By the end of that interview, the room was heavy with disappointment. They didn't need to say it out loud. He saw it in their eyes. The nods were curt, the thank yous robotic, the handshake weaker than expected. He walked out of that office not as a future employee, but as another failure story in the making. And when the rejection email hit his inbox later that week, his entire world collapsed in a single sentence. "We regret to inform you." Now, pause for a moment. What would you do if that happened to you? Would you accept the verdict and bury your dream? Would you hide behind excuses and whisper to yourself, "Maybe it wasn't meant for me"? Because most people would. Most people, when slammed against the wall of rejection, fold their dreams like old papers and toss them into the trash. But here's the burning truth, the kind that pierces deeper than any polite rejection letter. Failure doesn't kill dreams. Quitting does. He sat on his bed that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of the interview. The shame was unbearable. He imagined his friends asking how it went, his family expecting to hear good news, and himself admitting he wasn't good enough. Tears pressed against his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Instead, a question screamed louder than his pain. Is this really how my story ends? It's a question every dreamer faces at some point in life. Not the question of whether they can win, but whether they can survive losing. Because the world claps when you win, but it goes silent when you fail. That silence is where most people break. But it's also where a new kind of strength is born. The young man could have walked away. He could have said, "I tried," and moved on with his life. But something inside him, something raw and untamed, refused to die that night. He realized the job he had wanted wasn't the true prize. The true prize was becoming the kind of person who wouldn't give up even when the door slammed shut. Rejection, he whispered to himself, is not the end of the road. It's the redirection to the path I was meant to walk. Think about those words. How many times in history has rejection been the turning point for greatness? J.K. Rowling was rejected by 12 publishers before Harry Potter became a global legend. Walt Disney was fired for lacking creativity. Steve Jobs was rejected by his own company before returning to build Apple into an empire. And here he was, just another name in the long line of dreamers staring at the crossroad of despair and destiny. The difference between those who make history and those who vanish into it is this: they don't let rejection write their final chapter. That night, as the city outside his window glowed with 1,000 lights, he lit a fire inside himself. Not a fire of anger, not even of revenge, but a fire of resolve. He realized something powerful. Losing the interview wasn't the tragedy, it was the test. The company had rejected his answers, but life was giving him a bigger question. Will you rise, or will you stay down? The next morning, he didn't send out resumes blindly like a desperate man. Instead, he picked up a notebook and wrote down a vow. One day, I will not just sit in their office. I will own it. A vow made in pain is stronger than any dream whispered in comfort. And this vow would change the entire course of his life. Because when life breaks you, it's not handing you an ending, it's handing you a pen. And in that moment, he began writing a story the world would never forget. Sometimes you don't get what you want because life is preparing you for what you deserve. And so, the boy who walked into that office as a hopeful applicant walked out as something much greater, a fighter with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. This was not the end. This was the spark. Part 2, the day of the fall. The morning of the interview felt like the morning of battle. He had prepared for this day as if his entire existence depended on it. His resume gleamed, every word trimmed to perfection, every achievement polished to sound larger than life. He had practiced responses in the mirror until he could almost predict the rhythm of each question. His suit, pressed with sharp lines, carried not just fabric, but the weight of his dreams. This was supposed to be the day everything changed. This was supposed to be the beginning of the life he had envisioned since he first learned what ambition meant. Walking into the tall, glass-walled building, he felt both nervous and proud. The lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and coffee, filled with people who looked like they belonged to another world, a world he desperately wanted to enter. He clenched his fists lightly, whispering the words he had written down the night before. This is my moment. I am ready. But fate has a strange way of testing us. As he sat down across from the panel of interviewers, time seemed to slow. The first question was simple, one he had rehearsed 100 times. Yet, instead of his confident tone, a shaky voice came out. His throat dried, his palms sweated, and the polished answers he had memorized collapsed into fragments. The silence between each of his stumbles felt heavier than steel. He looked at their faces, stern, impatient, unreadable. One man tapped his pen against the desk. Another scribbled notes with cold detachment. Not a single smile, not a flicker of encouragement. The more he tried to recover, the deeper he sank. His carefully built confidence cracked open, spilling doubt all over the table. "Why should we hire you?" One of them asked, their tone sharp, almost bored. This was his chance to shine, his chance to deliver the line he had practiced 1,000 times. But when his lips parted, his words stumbled like broken glass. He gave an answer, but it lacked soul. It lacked conviction. It was as if his own voice betrayed him. By the end of that interview, he didn't need their decision. He already knew. Their polite nods and cold handshakes screamed louder than any rejection email ever could. You're not the one. When they finally said, "We'll be in touch," it felt like an execution masked in courtesy. He stood, forced a smile, thanked them for their time, and walked out of that suffocating room. But the moment the door closed behind him, his shoulders sagged and the air in his lungs felt heavy. He knew what that phrase meant. They weren't going to be in touch. His dream had slipped away, not with a dramatic thunderclap, but with a quiet, merciless whisper. Stepping out of the building, the city felt different. The same streets he had walked in with hope now mocked him with indifference. The crowd rushed past, strangers busy with their own lives, while he felt smaller than he had ever felt before. His polished shoes suddenly seemed too tight, his suit too heavy, his confidence completely hollow. The boy who had walked in dreaming of belonging had walked out as a stranger in his own skin. That night, lying on his bed, he stared at the ceiling with empty eyes. Every second of the interview replayed like a cruel movie. The missed opportunities, the nervous cracks, the look of disapproval etched on the interviewers' faces. It was torture. Shame burned hotter than any fire. He felt like he had let himself down, like he had betrayed every hour of work he had put in. But then something shifted. In the middle of his despair, a thought crept in, small at first, then louder. Maybe this wasn't my table. Maybe I wasn't meant to beg for a seat where I was never meant to belong. That realization struck him harder than the rejection itself. He had spent years chasing this single dream job, believing it was the only doorway to his future. But what if that door, the one that had slammed in his face, wasn't his door to begin with? He sat up, breathing heavily, the sting of rejection still fresh, but slowly transforming into something else, clarity. For the first time, he wondered if his life's mission wasn't about fitting into someone else's vision, but about creating one of his own. It reminded him of a quote he had once read, but never fully understood until now. A smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. Tonight, it made perfect sense. If life gave him everything easily, he would never discover the strength hidden inside him. Maybe the storm was the teacher, and this rejection was the lesson. He began to scribble thoughts in his notebook. Angry, raw, emotional lines poured out of him. I will not let this be the end. I will not stay down. If they close their doors to me, I will build my own doors. No, my own house, my own table. One day, they will not reject me. They will work for me. The words startled him. He had never dared to think that boldly before. All his life, he had been conditioned to chase approval, to seek acceptance, to win validation. But tonight, he realized the greatest victory wasn't being chosen. It was choosing yourself. Lying back down, his heart still ached, but his eyes carried a new fire. He wasn't naive. He knew the road ahead would be brutal, uncertain, and filled with battles he could barely imagine. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. Rejection hadn't killed him. It had birthed a warrior. He whispered into the darkness. Sometimes the door that slams in your face is the very door you were never meant to walk through. And with that, a new chapter quietly began. Because failure is not the opposite of success. It's the soil success grows from. Part 3, the spark of fire. What starts as humiliation often turns into revolution. For days, he couldn't erase the image of that interview panel from his mind. Their indifferent stares, their cold dismissal. The sting lingered like a scar. But instead of letting it rot him from the inside, he chose to transform it. The rejection letter arrived shortly after, a few unemotional lines typed neatly on company letterhead. "We regret to inform you." The words could have crushed him. But instead of tearing it up, he folded it carefully, pinned it on his wall, and stared at it like a warrior stares at his enemy. It wasn't just a letter anymore. It was fuel. Every morning, that piece of paper greeted him, not as a reminder of failure, but as a challenge. He whispered to himself, "You thought I wasn't good enough. One day, you'll remember my name." Instead of mourning, he studied. Instead of blaming, he learned. He devoured every book on leadership, business, and innovation he could get his hands on. He read until his eyes ached, until dawn peeked through the curtains. He scoured libraries, borrowed worn-out copies, highlighted paragraphs like a man on fire. When the world slept, he stayed awake, filling notebooks with strategies, sketches, and plans. He sought out mentors, people who had failed and risen again, people who knew the language of resilience. At first, many brushed him off, too busy or too skeptical to invest time in a young man carrying nothing but rejection. But persistence is louder than talent. Slowly, doors began to open. A retired CEO gave him an hour of wisdom. A small business owner shared the brutal truths of survival. A failed entrepreneur explained what not to do. Every conversation became another brick in the foundation he was building. Meanwhile, the whispers followed him like shadows. Friends laughed behind his back. Family, though well-meaning, doubted openly. You couldn't even pass an interview. Why waste your time chasing impossible dreams? Even neighbors muttered, shaking their heads as he stumbled home late at night, exhausted from working part-time jobs while burning his real energy into something invisible, an idea still taking shape. But in his chest burned a quiet, unshakable answer. "I'm not done yet." He had no investors, no big backing, no applause. Just a small rented desk in his room, a second-hand laptop, and a fire inside him that refused to go out. From that cramped space, he began sketching out the very ideas he had once pitched in that sterile interview room, the ones they had rejected without even listening. He thought to himself, "If they won't buy it, I'll build it myself." The first months were chaos. His so-called venture looked nothing like a company. It was messy, raw, and fragile. He made mistakes daily. His savings dwindled. Nights blurred into mornings as he coded, called, researched, and improvised. There were days he doubted himself, days he wondered if maybe the critics were right. But every time his hand trembled over that rejection letter pinned on the wall, his resolve hardened again. He reminded himself of a truth most forget: do not wait for opportunity. Create it. One night, while staring at his cluttered desk, he wrote a line in bold across his notebook. "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your own chair or build your own table." That became his mantra. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was building. As his work began taking shape, he noticed something strange. The very weaknesses the interviewers had mocked him for, the stutters, the nerves, the lack of polish, were irrelevant here. Here, in his own venture, he didn't need to impress anyone. His work spoke louder than his nerves ever could. His ideas didn't need permission to breathe. They needed execution. Bit by bit, his small venture started attracting attention. A friend who had once doubted him suddenly asked if he could help. A mentor introduced him to someone interested in his concept. Small clients appeared, skeptical at first, but impressed enough to pay. The money was tiny, laughable compared to what he had dreamed of, but it was real, and real was everything. Still, the journey was brutal. He faced rejections again, potential clients slamming doors, investors mocking his lack of experience, sleepless nights filled with uncertainty. But this time, rejection didn't break him. It fueled him. He had learned to wear failure like armor. Every no simply meant he was closer to the yes that mattered. The boy who had once crumbled in an interview was becoming a man who didn't need interviews anymore. He was creating his own stage, his own spotlight. There were moments of loneliness so deep they almost swallowed him. Nights when his body ached, his bank account mocked him, and his dreams felt too heavy to carry. Yet, whenever he thought of giving up, he remembered the panel of interviewers, their faces, their cold dismissal. And then he would whisper to himself, "This is why I can't stop." Slowly, his venture started breathing on its own. What began as scribbles and notebooks became prototypes, then products, then services people actually used. It was still fragile, but it was alive. Unlike the sterile rejection letter pinned to his wall, this venture had blood, sweat, and soul in it. He realized something profound during those early years. The world doesn't give you what you ask for. It gives you what you fight for. And he was ready to fight, because humiliation had given birth to hunger. Doubt had given birth to determination. And rejection, the very thing meant to destroy him, had become the spark of fire that would one day light up everything. Part 4. The Rise They Never Saw Coming. Years passed like pages in a book, each chapter more brutal and beautiful than the last. The boy who once walked out of a rejection room with trembling hands had transformed into a man building something extraordinary. What began as a messy experiment on a second-hand laptop turned into a small operation in a rented garage, and that garage slowly morphed into an office buzzing with energy. His office. His company. At first, nobody believed in it. Competitors dismissed him with laughter. Industry veterans rolled their eyes, muttering, "Another kid with a dream. He'll burn out in a year." But year after year, he refused to burn out. Instead, he burned brighter. His work ethic was relentless, his vision sharp, his hunger insatiable. Failure still came, but he no longer flinched. He had trained himself to eat rejection for breakfast and use it as fuel. As the company grew, so did the whispers. The same friends who once laughed at him now bragged about knowing him. Investors who once shut their doors began sending emails, begging for meetings. And the press? They loved the narrative of the underdog. Headlines started to appear. From failure to founder, the dream they laughed at now worth millions. And his favorite, rejection built his empire. With every step forward, he carried a secret weapon, memory. He remembered the humiliation of that first interview, the cold stares, the dismissive nods. It never left him, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder, because the moment you forget where you came from, you risk losing the fire that got you here. Inside his new boardroom, the air was different. No longer was he the nervous boy fumbling for answers. He was the man at the head of the table, the one others looked to for decisions. He wasn't chasing approval anymore. Approval was chasing him. And then came the twist life had been preparing him for all along. The company that had once rejected him, the so-called dream job that slipped through his fingers, was now collapsing under its own weight. Poor management, arrogance, and lack of innovation had turned it from a powerhouse into a sinking ship. Their reputation was in shambles, their finances bleeding. The news broke across the industry. The once mighty firm was seeking buyers. Competitors circled like vultures, smelling opportunity. But fate had written a plot so sharp, so poetic, it could almost make you believe destiny has a sense of humor. The man who stepped forward wasn't a rival CEO, wasn't a faceless corporation. It was him, the very candidate they had once told wasn't good enough. When his team placed the final bid and the acquisition was approved, he knew what had to be done. He walked back into that same building, through the same glass doors that once made him feel small. But this time his shoulders didn't slump. His steps didn't shake. He wasn't here for validation. He was here as the new owner. The boardroom looked almost the same. The polished table, the leather chairs, the faint smell of expensive cologne. But everything had changed. Because this time, he wasn't sitting nervously across from them. He was sitting at the head. His name was etched on the contracts. The walls that once rejected him now belonged to him. The executives who had once judged him avoided eye contact, their arrogance replaced by desperation. They no longer asked him questions. They answered his. And as the meeting concluded, he leaned back, remembering a quote he had lived through. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Victory didn't feel like revenge. It felt like justice. It felt like proof that the universe doesn't reward those who never fail. It rewards those who never quit. But what made the moment powerful wasn't just the acquisition. It was what it symbolized. Years ago, he had begged for a seat at this very table. Now, he owned the table. He didn't just get in the door. They had no choice but to hand him the keys to the entire building. Walking out of that boardroom, his heart wasn't bitter. He wasn't thinking about payback. He was thinking about possibility. Because if failure could lead him here, then what else was possible? If rejection could plant the seed of an empire, then what other storms could be turned into gardens? Reporters later asked him what it felt like to own the company that once rejected him. He smiled and said, "Rejection is a gift. It forces you to build something no one can deny." Behind those words was a truth only he could understand. The pain of failure had been real. The nights of doubt had been endless. But without them, he would have never grown into the man who could carry an empire. The rise they never saw coming wasn't just about money or ownership. It was about transformation. The world had measured him by a single failed interview. But he had measured himself by resilience, grit, and fire. And in the end, those were the currencies that mattered most. Part 5. The Legacy of Rejection. The story spread across the city like a spark racing through dry grass. Impossible to contain. Headlines screamed his name, not as a man who once stumbled in an interview, but as the architect of a revolution. He wasn't just successful. He had become a symbol. What fascinated people wasn't merely the fact that he now owned the very company that once discarded him. That was poetic, yes, but it wasn't the real story. The real story was the transformation. A man who once left a boardroom with shaking hands now returned with an empire in his pocket. What people couldn't ignore was that he didn't stop when the world said no. He built a new world where he could say yes to himself. Young dreamers began to follow him, not just for business advice, but for courage. Universities invited him to speak, not about profit margins or quarterly growth, but about resilience. His words were raw, unpolished, and painfully honest. He told them, "Failure is not your enemy. Failure is your forge. Every no you hear is hammering you into something stronger. Every rejection is bending you, shaping you, preparing you. The world will test you not to destroy you, but to see if you can endure." He never sugarcoated his past. He admitted the sleepless nights, the tears, the shame of being doubted by everyone, even himself. But he always added this: none of it was wasted. Every bruise became a blueprint. Every scar carried a lesson. Slowly, a movement was born. Not a company, not a brand, but a mindset. Young men and women began pinning their rejection letters to walls, not as wounds, but as fuel, just like he once did. Some called it madness, others called it delusion, but he called it power. Because if rejection could create him, it could create anyone willing to endure. But here's the bold truth he lived by: success wasn't the finish line. Buying that company wasn't the crown jewel of his journey. That was just the spark. The true victory was creating a fire in others, a fire that burned past excuses, past fear, past doubt. And so he declared, openly and fearlessly, "You're not defined by the jobs you get or the doors that slam in your face. You're defined by the fire you carry when the world shuts every door." The world doesn't owe you a seat at the table. Build your own table. And if they don't give you a crown, forge one. Those words echoed in classrooms, in cafes, in late-night conversations between dreamers who were ready to quit but chose to keep going. His story became less about him and more about what he represented. Proof that rejection was not the end, but the birthplace of revolutions. The legacy of rejection spread far beyond the walls of his company. Startups rose in cities where hope had been dying. Students chased ideas that professors once called foolish. Artists, writers, inventors, and builders all began to embrace rejection not as shame, but as strategy. His name turned into shorthand for resilience. People would say, "Remember him. Remember what he did when they told him no." And perhaps the most powerful moment came years later, when one of his speeches was quoted back to him by a young founder on a global stage. "Do not surrender. Do not bow. Rejection is not your grave. It is your garden. Plant your pain, water it with persistence, and let the world choke on the forest you grow." Hearing his own words come alive through the voices of others, he realized something profound. His life was no longer his own. It belonged to every dreamer who had been told, "You're not good enough." It belonged to every fighter staring at a slammed door, wondering if they had the strength to try again. The legacy was never about money or ownership or even victory. It was about courage. It was about choosing not to die in the dark just because the world refused to hand you light. So when the next generation faced rejection, they didn't crumble. They remembered him. They remembered the boy who once failed an interview and the man who later bought the building. They remembered that rejection is not the opposite of success. It is the soil from which success grows. And with that memory, they rose. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.